I found myself saying that the Overton window is shifted, which isn't particularly original, but it seems to have shifted only for everyone outside of the elite class. So, for example, you talking about the pause, I remember hearing you talk about a mass immigration pause on an SDP talks back in 2020. And I remember at the time thinking, oh, wow, I actually can't believe someone said that. It actually seems sensible, but I've never really noticed anyone say it publicly before. And now actually people are talking about cessation. And if we talk about the Overton window shifting here, but also out in Europe, I mean, immigration is the number one concern pretty much everywhere. And I know you mentioned people who here legally are British, and that's the end of it. But it's quite interesting how that seems to be shifting in other countries. So Sweden is trialing or instituting a remigration policy, even for naturalized Swedes, people who they consider not to have integrated very well, and the Swiss are doing it as well. They've are revoking the citizenship of long-term drains. So anyone who have been here even for a couple of generations and they've taken out more than they put in, they've been sending back to Kosovo recently, for example, and then in Germany, in response to the AfD making some more headway as they keep on doing, there's been this idea of closing the borders, or at least bringing in border checks and trying to stop certain kinds of immigration. And so I wonder, because Britain, regardless of what people have tried to paint it as post-Brexit as being this kind of basket case, which I don't believe at all, but we've always maintained throughout our history, I'd say, this idea of moderation, even in the periods where there were, nonconformist dissenters and traditionalists all sworn against one another, but they would still keep a lid on how it is that they spoke, and they'd always try and find a synthesis way through instead of moving too radically. And whilst I see that Europe seems to be undergoing this sea change in their approach to immigration, including past immigration and what they're trying to do to rebalance the scales, I think, well, I feel like Britain needs that too, but I also can't imagine us doing it. Almost even if a new elite class was to come and knock the current one off its perch. What do you think about what's going on in Europe? And for example, it's just a thought experiment and not trying to put your name to it. Do you imagine Britain ever doing something similar to the Swedes and the Swiss?
It's interesting. I think there are very big differences. I think I don't. I mean, the fact that the British public didn't turn to either communism or fascism or Nazism in the 20s or 30s is significant. I think there are also very, very evident differences in how the British coped with and handled the post-imperial situation, decolonization, the winds of change, post-war. Very, very different. I'm a very close watcher of Portugal, and I love the country. I speak Portuguese, and I've read a lot of Portuguese history. But if you take, France obviously fought bitterly to retain its empires, and the famous ones in Vietnam. And they suffered the first big loss as a European power at Dien Bien Phu, and then in Algeria famously. But they fought for it bitterly, and the Portuguese actually did the same in Angola and Mozambique, and fought 15-year counterinsurgency war to keep colonies that they really couldn't keep in the end. And the British had a totally different attitude and thought, the game's up, let's go. I mean, I know you had Ian Smith and Rhodesia, but a slightly different situation. But even that was that was slightly atypical. What Smith did there because demographically they were done for. So I think there is something in the national character that's distinct from continental Europe, and I think I would predict from now continental Europe will hurtle towards some form of genuinely what you would call far right situation. It'll just get worse. I think most European states have had and actually have parties that are genuinely on the fringe, on the fringes, and they get large votes. So it's quite different to here. I don't really see that happening here, and genuinely, I think I think the most British people. I know we've had the civil disturbances after the Southport outrage, but I think that was slightly chaotic, spontaneous, and I don't think actually Rod Liddell said that he thought it was more to do with football hooliganism and criminality than, or at least as much, with those two things as it was with politics. And I do agree with him. I sort of flippantly said at the time, I don't think the people, throwing things in Hartlepool or Middlesbrough had read Gabriella D'Annunzio. I don't think they were convinced fascists, really. But they may have had some unsavory views. But so I think we're probably quite distinct in that respect. I don't think I'm being complacent. I just think it's more a sort of national character. We're more likely to have a cup of tea and think, oh, what a pity, than we are to sort of burn the place down. And in a way, that's a good thing. But of course, it belies a sort of complacency that could get you into serious trouble when you do need to react to something. But in the British political landscape, I think my prediction would be it'll be quite different to continental Europe. I think the really, really interesting thing about Europe is that the things that Orban was saying 12 years ago, or even the previous Polish government was saying about these things, and the European Union establishment was slagging them off. Now the Dutch, the Swedes, the Germans, the French, the Italians, they're all saying it. They're all saying it. So that's shifted very, very rapidly. And the big thing will be, because eventually it will happen. I mean, the European Union isn't particularly democratic. You know, the European Parliament is a bit of theatre, really. The power is in the Council of Ministers and the Commission. But if the member states feed people into the Council of Ministers and to the Commission that represent an Orban-esque type of politics, then the European Union itself will overnight become, in inverted commas, warning signs, far right. That's probably going to happen. I think that's probably likely to happen. And then, of course, it'll be quite interesting. And from a Schadenfreude point of view, it'll be interesting to see what all these British Europhiles think of that. Could be quite comical.
Well, we've ended up talking about immigration, William. I suppose we talked a bit about policy. You talked about a cessation being required on mass immigration, and talked about how our national character as Brits would mean we will likely do things differently to our continental cousins, as it were. What kind of deterrence do you think would be acceptable to both the British people and that the SDP would bring in? So, for example, there's lots of talks about, with regards to illegal immigration, how people would go about stopping the boats. So we've had Labour talk about smashing the gangs, which of course doesn't seem to be working. The numbers have increased from the already high numbers that the Tory party presided over. And I would say you can find it quite commonly amongst people to say, well, just turn them back, take them back to France. Do you know what would work? Would you talk about bringing back a Rwanda plus turning people back to the French shores? What do you think the SDP would do if you were parachuted into government overnight?
Well, it's published on the SDP website, so you can have a look. But basically, I think we do know what would work, and nothing that any other party proposes will work for various reasons. What will work so they're separate things. I mean, there's immigration in general, which is immigration policy, legal migration. There's overstayers and all sorts of other things. But the sort of the visceral problem, the acute problem is people just wandering into your state unannounced, uninvited, unsolicited, and that's the Channel migrant crisis, which occasionally causes tragedy as well, where people drown. So how do we solve the Channel migrant crisis? People just rocking up and arriving. Well, what you don't do is propose things like pushing back boats in the Channel. You can't do that. for various reasons. One of the reasons is that the French won't accept your interdiction of boats in their waters. So when you get to French waters, what do? You have to have cooperation. You won't get cooperation with France because it's not in France's interest to have these migrants in their state. They prefer they just put them onto Britain. They don't these migrants in their jurisdiction. So that won't happen. And also, as a point I've made before, and I've made to Richard Tice personally, that I don't think such a policy would survive the first large capsize. I don't think if you've got 80 people on a boat and you pushed it back and it capsized and 70 of them drowned, I'm sorry, your policy must end there. It's not going to happen. You cannot possibly pursue a policy that would risk that or cause that. You can't. It's beyond the bounds of what is possible. Keir Starmer's thing about just toughening up police involvement in gangs. Well, that's just pie in the sky. They do that anyway. I mean, the Tories have done that for a long time. The British authorities, both military and police, have done it, and they've cooperated with the French and Interpol on it for a long time. And it's got them nowhere, and they can't seem to deal with it. So that doesn't call all Keir Starmer's doing there is calling it something different. Border command or whatever he calls it. So that's not going to do it. But the SDB policy would do it, which is that anyone arriving unsolicited on the south coast would be picked up, taken to Brize Norton and flown to Ascension Island, and they'd be detained in an offshore facility. And they would be detained there until they go either back to where they came from or to a third country. And it wouldn't just be Rwanda or Albania; it'd be any country. But one of the only place they would not be allowed to come to is Britain. Now, the point I make about that is that if you implemented that, your interdiction rate would be 100%. I mean, it's perfectly within the capacity of the authorities to intercept every single boat. 100% of boats coming across illegally would be intercepted, and 100% of people arriving unsolicited illegally would be shipped off to Ascension. So the point I make about that is that the flow would stop overnight. Literally, it would collapse overnight. The deal is a really excellent deal at the moment for migrants, because what you do is you pay €5,000, and for that €5,000, you get almost probable. The grant rate is so high in this country, 85% on most categories. You're almost certain to obtain for that €5,000 permanent access to the British social wage forever for you and your family, because you first and then family reunions the rest of your family. So it's just an incredible bargain. I mean, it's like as an investment, it's a colossal return. Now, if you incentivize people to such an extent, you shouldn't be surprised that people take you up on the offer and do it. That's what they're doing. So I've always said you need to change the incentives. Now, if the incentive is that you get shipped to Ascension Island, you stay there, possibly for years, waiting to go back to where you came from or to another place, you are not going to part with your €5,000. You're just not going to do it. No sane person would do that. So that is the policy. And I've done interview after interview after interview. That is the policy that you would stop this illegal flow through. That's how you do it. Now, in order to do it, you have to remove yourself from the post-war protocols that the country signed up to. And legally, it's perfectly possible to do that. You just disincorporate them. We've incorporated this law into British law, but Parliament is still, the people are sovereign, but Parliament can take the action necessary to remove ourselves from those protocols. And so if you dismantle a legal architecture which prevents you from controlling your border, it's a prerequisite to do that. If you get rid of that, then you can do what we suggest, and you would instantly get control of the border. Now, you then get on to we discussed earlier about why certain things are the case, and demoralization and the collapse in self-assertion are the cultural causes of this. I'm asked a lot, why don't governments do this? And I don't want to be flippant, but basically it's because they don't want to. That's the answer. They don't want to. During the pandemic, you saw our government do lots of things that were quite dramatic and draconian and emergency, and they did them because they wanted to. In this case, the political class don't want to get a control of the border in this way, and that's why it doesn't happen. But it shouldn't. We shouldn't kid ourselves that we can't do it. We certainly could do it if we wanted to do it. And as I say, if you had a leader like Lee Kuan Yew post-Brexit, a lot of this had been done a long time ago.
We've spoken about the ability to be able to do this, and indeed we've seen Australia do it, albeit with lower numbers, but a much bigger bit of water that was being crossed, and they were able to, as you say, collapse the numbers overnight, and so they have a handful as opposed to tens of thousands of people being detained on an island offshore. And we've also spoken a bit about how you forecasting that there could be a real shift to the right in Europe, and I can't help but think it's because ultimately those who are governing at the moment keep on trying to find more inventive ways of keeping them out and not listening to the concerns of, let's call them, the populists. And it seems, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who's saying this, that if you actually just listen to the concerns and try to deal with those and deal with the problem, that you might stop people flocking to these parties for a start. But the other thing is the longer you keep something down for, the longer you hold that balloon underwater, it's going to find a way of coming up eventually. And the deeper you hold it, the more violent its reaction. And I suppose I've been thinking a little bit about a Rudyard Kipling poem, where he always seems to have these poems which can capture the psyche of the British people. And anyway, there's this one verse in called The Beginnings, and he says, let me get it up actually, because I don't want to get it wrong. He said, their voices were even and low, their eyes were level and straight. There was neither sign nor show when the English began to hate. And the reason why I bring this up is I am a little bit concerned by a couple of things. So number one, we've got this balkanization going on, which we talked about. We've now got people feeling a sense of cultural loss. On the other side, I do find it commendable that it's being spoken about, but Eric Kaufman is talking about how this race taboo seems to govern most of Western society. And in many ways, you can see why it's there, because you don't want there to be ethnic strife ultimately. And you would hope that actually by removing it, you can make more sensible policy decisions. But I'm a little bit concerned that through the Overton window shifting, which I think it is, and if the current elite class just keeps that balloon underwater even longer and doesn't listen to the concerns and keeps juicing mass immigration and keeps the borders open to illegal immigrants and keeps providing people jumping the queue for various public services before those who are legally here, that the liberal tolerance, which was part of and has been part of the British mindset for a few centuries, if and when that goes, that we could see some, not just that low intensity civil war John Gray talks about, but some seriously nasty stuff on the streets. I don't know if you or the political class, I suppose, that you find yourselves rubbing shoulders with, or at least challenging, do you think there's a concern about that, or does no one think that's a way that it'll go?
I think that we're going to have to stop agreeing on things like this. Very well put, John. Yeah, no, I'm quite complacent. I think there are some people in the political class that understand it. Probably conservatives like Miriam Cates and Danny Kruger understand it. I think Maurice Glassman understands it on the Labour side. Paul Embry understands it on the Labour side. But I think far too many of the Liberals, and they're all basically liberal progressives, which dominate, they don't really see it, and they sort of would tend to double down. And I think there's a strong whiff of Kuhnianism. The Thomas Kuhn, the science philosopher, talked about people's reluctance to give up their cherished beliefs and theories, and particularly in the social sphere, the people don't like to accept they're wrong. So a lot of the liberalism, as liberalism fails in front of us, it's the liberal paradox. Very, very simply, the liberal paradox. If you run liberal progressive policies, you'll destroy your society with those policies, and you'll end up with a society that isn't liberal. That's the paradox. I mean, it's not difficult to understand really if you just pay attention. But some of these people will go to their graves holding on, rather like the communists, just saying, well, it hasn't been done right, or the problem is the far right, or the problem is this, or the problem is that, and they just don't accept that their own policies are the root of the problems. So I don't see a dawning of a realization among the ruling class necessarily. I think actually Brexit was a good example where post-Brexit, it's just been they haven't taken any lesson from Brexit, none at all, nothing. They haven't. And if Brexit was Brexit was a proxy in some respects. There were two things in Brexit: it was sovereignty and immigration. But it was because you didn't vote on immigration in Brexit, it was a proxy vote for immigration. It was obviously an important issue. What did the Tories do? Just double down, just increase it even more. So the capacity of the elite to learn and adapt, I would say, is pretty low. But I do think you're absolutely spot on about the dangers, because it is the metaphor of whether you quote Kipling, and that's a very famous poem, the one you read out there. The whether it's that or the other metaphor, which is which is one that economists like, which is the brick on a bit of elastic. You pull on the elastic and the brick doesn't move, and suddenly it moves and hits you in the face. That's sort of where we are. I think that's the challenge we face, and in a way, a political project like the Social Democratic Party, speaking truths and being candid and honest about the data about some of these things, and saying some things that people find a little bit uncomfortable but need saying. It's part of the pressure valve. It's part of releasing a pressure valve, which is necessary in the way that any election should be necessary to correct things. But the ruling class had better start listening, and I don't see huge evidence that that's happening, and it is a concern. But on the other hand, you do need a political project, and there are a lot of think tanks and a lot of journalists and a lot of very good people saying things that are important. Eric Kaufman is one of them. David Goodhart's another. But you do need a political vehicle in the end. You need to have something where people go in a polling booth and actually elect someone, and that's why we're sort of continuing doing what we're doing.
Well, William, it's a perfect segue, the opening part of your response to the question I like to ask all of my guests. You talked about how the current elites won't give up their cherished beliefs and will go to the grave grasping hold of them. I like to ask my guests what you have changed your mind on in the course of your life that you previously saw as set in stone, and what was it that made you think differently?
Well, there's two things really. The most important one is the European Union. So when I was like most other social democrats in the 80s, when I was involved as a teenager and then in my 20s, I was pretty passionate believer in European unity and the European project, in inverted commas. So I was very, very keen on it, to the extent that I had a little, European unity sticker on my car. That's how far it went. So very keen, very, very keen indeed on it. But actually my slow to start, but my Euroscepticism pretty much traced David Owen's, because people forget actually the Owenite SDP in 1989 at conference ruled out a united Europe. So they were already parting ways to some extent with the liberals, who remained quite fanatical on it. But really the change, I am keen on reading against my opinion. I think everyone should do this. I think you should do this. I don't think you should read rubbish, but you should read good stuff that disagrees with your position, to see if it moves you. And apart from anything else, just the sort of J.S. Mill point is that you don't know your own case if you don't know someone else's, your opponent's case. You've got to know both to know your own case properly. So what happened on this was Peter Riddle reviewed Peter Shaw book called Separate Ways in the Times about 20 years plus ago. And it was a very good review. And it was Peter Shaw, full throttle Eurosceptic, Labour Eurosceptic, Benite Euroscepticism, and why the European Union couldn't possibly happen and couldn't possibly work. And nation states was basically the upper limit of democracy, and you couldn't practice. The point Shaw made was that you couldn't practice the social democracy you profess to want to implement if you sign the treaties, because the treaties prevent you. It's as simple as that. On the left, it really is as simple as that. So anyway, I bought the book and read it, very impressed with it, and read it again, and sort of over Damascene conversion, really, sort of overnight became a Eurosceptic, and I've remained a Eurosceptic ever since, because basically Shaw takes the palm. He's right, happens to be right about this, and particularly from a left-wing point of view, but he, just from a nation-state point of view, happens to be right. So that's the big one that I've changed on, is that. The other one that's worth mentioning is that when I was in the Tory party for the 4 years, I went through a slightly immature sort of libertarian phase. Didn't last very long, but I read. Well, I was inclined to sort of believe that individual liberty was the be-all and end-all, but I sort of grew out of it as in my early 30s, and realized in the end that the I-we balance and the tendency to put yourself first above wider duties and wider communities was actually part of the problem, won't be the solution. So I sort of grew out of that, but that's worth a mention as well.
Phases, I think lots of people go through. I think I've also been through both of those, having started off as a staunch Remainer and then having become a reformed Remainer not long after, about a year after, when I realised the impact of a second vote would have on civic relations, and also having just learned a bit about the European Union, realised that wasn't particularly the place that I would want to be if I had to go back to first principles. And yeah, the libertarianism point, I think when anyone starts getting into political philosophy, it starts to it can be quite beguiling, and then you realise that it can be corrosive if it's the only value that you're placing above all else.
Yeah, it's the problem with libertarianism is that it's a bit like the sort of ultra free trade economics. It's easy to understand. Yeah. So it's a political concept, a political idea. It's very easy to grasp instantly, and then people become bewitched by it and just apply it all over the place, whether it works or not. And I was in debating libertarians. I was say, just name one state where such a political program has worked, and I would say one will do, because it just doesn't, it just doesn't work. It's impossible. There you go.
Well, quite right, William. It's been an absolute pleasure. Before I let you go, what can we expect from you and the SDP in the coming months and years? What are you working on?
Well, it's quite an interesting time for us. As you say, we've gone off this general election where we've got a record vote for us since the 80s, and 122 candidates, the party election broadcast, and we continue to win seats on Leeds City Council, which makes me very happy. I think the challenge for us is to expand the party, to expand the participants in it, because we've got great people in it, and it's all right for me to head it up, but I've got to get a broader picture there. But it's very exciting because Labour is so weak and becoming so weak. They've had such a bad start. Remember that the seats we've taken off them in the northern cities has been when they've been in opposition and standing at 45 in the polls and things. So I hope it will become, slightly more straightforward to take seats off them in this parliament. So that's really what I'm looking forward to, is to building up our base in the town halls and city halls, and then towards the next election, just having a bigger slate, a bigger offer, and growing the party. And I think if we keep on going, we will succeed.
Well, all power to you. Good luck with all of that. I'm sure there are many we're rooting for you, and also for reform to make some serious inroads into Labour and the Tories in 5 years' time. So keep fighting the good fight, and hope to have you on again in the future. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Likewise. A pleasure chatting, John. Take care.
To keep up to date with all that I am doing, please subscribe to the Thinking Class YouTube channel @ThinkingClass and follow me on X @ThinkingClasses. Thinking Class seeks to understand the civilizational issues we face and why what our leaders do in response matters. Here, I seek to explore the ideas, values, and culture that made our civilization, those that are unmaking it, and how leaders at our public and private institutions should respond. Engage with me on YouTube or X, or write to me at thinkingclasspod@gmail.com to tell me who you want me to speak to and what topics are important to you. I look forward to seeing you there and for joining me on this journey.